the year 1820, the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni recorded his thoughts about the people of Egypt, both the ancient pharaohs whose treasures he had removed, as well as its present inhabitants, Arabs, Copts, and Turks. In looking at an edifice of such magnitude, workmanship, and antiquity, inhabited by a half-savage people, whose huts are stuck against it, not unlike wasps' nests, and to contrast their filthy clothes with these sacred images that were once so highly venerated, makes one strongly feel the difference between the ancient and modern states of Egypt. Like most Europeans who visited Egypt in the early 19th century, Belzoni was not impressed with the current inhabitants of the country. For him, only the pharaohs and their timeless monuments were worthy of admiration. No doubt, he imagined, the pharaohs were equally pleased to be the object of his praise. In justifying the removal of the Memnum head, a 7-ton block of exquisitely carved granite lying in the sands of Luxor, he gave the following description. I found it near the remains of its body and chair, with its face upwards, and apparently smiling on me at the thought of being taken to England. For the next 100 years, fortune would continue to smile upon a great many explorers, archaeologists, and adventurers from Europe. Like Belzoni, they circled the globe in search of cultural treasures and geographical knowledge. Today, our understanding of who they were and what they did tends to be filtered through the cinematic lens of the immensely popular Indiana Jones film franchise. But just how much of these portrayals are accurate? After all, no one person served as the inspiration for this Hollywood icon. Back in 1978, when George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Larry Kasdan first sat down to brainstorm the idea of Indiana Jones, they drew upon a wide assortment of hazy impressions and ideas that were culled from the pulp hero comic book presses of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So where did that idea of a globe-trotting debonair archaeologist come from? Despite the fact that no single figure can represent the breadth and diversity of those who scoured the globe for antiquities, it is in fact possible to sketch a broad outline of their most consistent features, as well as the conditions under which they worked. The historical Indiana Jones was defined and bound by several distinct criteria. The first three were time, place, and gender. First, Indiana Jones was almost always a man. Second, he, or his ancestors, had lived in Europe at some point between 1750 and 1969. Third, this time frame means that he was a product of empire. More specifically, he was the product of just a mere handful of European empires that, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, managed to control or colonize the peoples of nearly every other country on Earth for a period of about 150 years. Archaeologists played an important role in this political drama, unearthing the cultural capital that allowed one empire to claim supremacy over each of its rivals. After the Second World War, when most of these European empires lost their colonies, the historical Indiana Jones disappeared. Why? The answer is simple. In order to conjure up the romance, adventure, and controversies of the globe-trotting archaeologist, he needs to not only be able to cross borders with impunity, but also trust that he can fill his luggage with statues and manuscripts from a distant land without fear of reprisal. To illustrate this point more fully, consider for a moment the famous terracotta warriors of China. Discovered in 1974, the terracotta warriors represent one of the greatest and most spectacular archaeological finds in modern history. And yet they play absolutely no role in our story. This is because they were discovered, preserved, and exhibited entirely by the Chinese themselves at a time when no foreign scholar could possibly imagine or even attempt to justify their removal abroad. As a result, the significance of the terracotta warriors lies mostly in what they can tell us about ancient China. They tell us much less about the history of the world in 1974, other than that China was united and sovereign at the time, and fully capable of keeping unwelcome foreigners at bay. By contrast, as we will see in episodes 9 and 10 of this series, the excavation of the tomb of King Tut in Egypt will tell us a great deal about the history of Europe and the Middle East during the 1920s. This is because it was discovered not by the Egyptians themselves, but by a foreigner who fully expected to be able to remove the majority of the tomb's antiquities to a foreign land in perpetuity. Unlike with the terracotta warriors of China, The intriguing story of how these expectations failed to materialize reveals a great number of complex political developments in the Middle East during the interwar era. In addition to time, place, and gender, was education. Whether self-taught or the product of the best schools and universities in the world, the historical Indiana Jones was highly educated. More important than the mere fact of his education, however, was the specific content of the curriculum. Nearly everyone who charted the land or dug up the soil was steeped in the knowledge of two great bodies of works, the Greek and Roman classics and the Bible. Well into the 20th century, most explorers tended to interpret nearly everything they encountered in terms of its imagined connection to someone, something, or some place mentioned in the Greek, Latin, or Hebrew literary canon. As far as they were concerned, anything worthy of their respect must somehow be related to a handful of ancestors deemed most responsible for the creation of Western civilization as it was defined at the time. The unique lens of this classical education constrained the ability of the archaeologist to acknowledge or appreciate the possibility that anyone, other than his own preferred ancestors, could have contributed something of value to the world he lived in. As far as he was concerned, the world contained only three types of people. The first were enlightened Europeans, who, through their practice of science, both defined and claimed the mantle of modernity. The second were less civilized Orientals, who, though they may once have been great in some distant land and time, had long since stagnated and degenerated. Below them were the savages, who had never contributed anything at all of value to civilization. Most of these people were studied by the Europeans as if they were monkeys in a laboratory. One of the more discomforting means by which they did so was through a now discredited scientific practice referred to at the time as a form of anthropometry. It involved the measurement of cranial capacities and other physical traits in an attempt to correlate race with the ability or inability to contribute to civilization. Though the Nazis would take this practice the furthest, well into the 20th century, most Western archaeologists subscribed to some form of racial determinism and spent a significant amount of time and energy collecting data to support their theories. Not every single person who lived outside of Europe was viewed as barbaric or uncivilized, however. In fact, Western explorers and archaeologists often made a careful distinction between non-Western elites and non-Western commoners. The elites were usually met on equal terms, at least in practice, if not always in representation. By contrast, though they rarely admitted it, European explorers tended to view the masses of lower-class peoples outside of Europe in exactly the same way that they viewed their own social inferiors back home. They were both seen as ignorant, lazy, addicted to pleasure, fond of wasteful diversions, filthy and unkempt, and unable to control their basest desires. Such people were deemed fit only for menial labor, and openly referred to as mercenaries bereft of any higher purpose in life. But local elites, be they in the Near East or in China, could sometimes be regarded as just as civilized as the Western explorer himself. For example, in 1907, the British explorer Mark Aurel Stein contrasted the refined behavior and mannerisms of his educated Chinese secretary with that of manual laborers he had brought with him from India. It is great comfort to have a gentleman by one's side, and one ever cheerful. The petty ways of my Indian assistants, and their indifference to any higher aims, puts my Chinese helpmates' value into double relief. With the rest, one is again and again reminded that one is dealing with mercenaries. One of these so-called mercenaries, a Gurkha cartographer named Ram Singh, repeatedly challenged the unequal hierarchy into which Stein, his employer, had placed him. Though Stein would never admit such indelicacies to his adoring public, the insecurities of the European explorer are on full display in the terse comments recorded in his private field diary. Had to hurry on Ram Singh, who was taking his meal at 8 a.m., declaring he could not get up earlier. Insolent attitude and outburst on account of my remonstrating. Presumes to state his opinion about me personally and attempts to leave by asking the camelmen to unload. Stopped this barefaced insubordination. With the local Chinese elites, however, Stein was more in his element, among men he regarded as his social equals. Together they enjoyed sumptuous banquets, elaborate gift-giving rituals, and discussions of history and politics. They often also staged friendly displays of martial prowess, in one case even allowing a concubine, draped in formal dress, to impress the foreigner with her target-shooting skills. In this remarkable photograph, taken by the Finnish explorer Gustav Mannerheim in 1907, her bound feet rest just to the left of a pile of spent shells. Last but not least, we cannot ignore the role of money. Without money, the real-life Indiana Jones was little more than a glorified grave robber, scarcely distinguishable from the lower-class workers whom he both employed and ritually denigrated. With money, however, he possessed the means and connections to justify his labors in ways that clearly set him apart from everyone else. Where did this money come from? Usually not from the explorer or archaeologist himself. Most often, it came from the pockets of the wealthiest and most powerful people of his society. Expeditions were expensive undertakings, and most people who wanted to uncover sand-buried antiquities in distant lands could not afford to do so by themselves. So wealthy businessmen and influential politicians usually stepped in to do so on their behalf. But why? What could a man who already had everything hope to gain by sponsoring a dig? In a word, respect. In 2 words, money laundering. To put it another way, the most successful politicians and businessmen are always on the lookout for ways to improve their image, be it one intended for the general public or merely one aimed at their own small circle of elite rivals. And what better way to build a reputation for benevolence and altruism than to invest your hard-won gains into a scientific endeavor that is widely advertised as a boon to the public good? From this perspective, the institution of the modern museum serves as a means by which the morally dubious acquisition of wealth and power can be laundered into social respectability.
This is the second time I've had to reclaim my property from you.
That belongs in a museum.
So do you.
Because museums were often free and open to the public, they were widely viewed as ideal mediums through which to educate and improve the moral fiber of the masses. By extension, to associate oneself with a museum was to take crudely acquired money and infuse it with a public relations campaign that was couched in the name of science, preservation, and education. In the worlds of art and archaeology, money and politics were a constant presence. The real-life Indiana Jones played an integral role in providing those who possessed untold riches and power with the means by which to justify and maintain their privileged positions in life. The real skill of Indiana Jones may not have been his bullwhip, but rather his remarkable ability to turn backstabbing misers into philanthropists and blood-soaked generals into kings. The broad outlines of who the real-life Indiana Jones was and what he did are fairly clear and consistent, but no 2 explorers or archaeologists were entirely alike, nor are any of the themes described thus far sufficient on their own to encapsulate the course of every expedition. The richness is truly in the details. Please join us in this series as we explore 20 of the most interesting and revealing case studies in archaeological exploration over the past 250 years. Join us as we explore Indiana Jones in history.